Hello, everyone. My name is Quinn Rydell, and today I am discussing Erikson's theory of psychosocial development and the role it plays in identity, self esteem, culture, and the impact it has overall on student learning. So, Erikson, his theory focuses mainly on the creation of the self, the efforts of individual learners to try out different aspects of identity and sort of pick and choose what works for them and create really their own unique personal identity. It also focuses on, in the later stages, relationships with others. And while Erikson doesn't do a great job covering the role things like culture, race, and gender play in development, further researchers like Marcia and William Cross do a great job of adding to that theory and really strengthening a pretty glaring weakness that I felt Erikson's theory has. So, Erikson divided development, like Piaget, into 8 stages called the 8 ages of man. They were all characterized by some sort of struggle. So the way the stages are mapped out, and you'll see this in a second, is it is A versus B. So it'll be positive trait versus negative trait. And Erikson defines successfully, I guess, passing through a stage as finding the healthy balance between the more generally positive trait and maybe the more generally negative but situationally effective trait. So, a good little metaphor that I think can help you guys remember that is that success under Erikson is like a fruit smoothie. You can eat your blueberries, you can eat your strawberries, but the tastiest option, and in the theory's case, the best option for learners, is to find that balance of both and mix the two things together. So now we're going to go ahead and dive into Erikson's stages. He starts off at birth. So this theory is really interesting because the 8 stages cover the entirety of a human life, which is not something we had with Piaget. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. And the reason it is trust versus mistrust first is because as an infant, you're learning to trust, like you're actually learning to trust. You express yourself through crying, obviously, and this isn't a conscious thing that you're doing, but you express that you need something, and when the needs are taken care of, it builds a sense of trust between typically the infant and the mother, because that's traditionally who cares for the infant. But the trust is the important part, and it should, if they successfully build a trusting relationship, learners should have no problem creating secure relationships based on trust, but still not blindly giving away their trust to anyone and people who may not deserve that. So, on to the second stage, autonomy versus shame. In this stage, the child starts to kind of take action for themselves. The big challenge in this stage is toilet training. That's the first super autonomous skill you learn, really. I mean, eating, toilet training, those are both kind of the first two, and those both occur in this time frame of 18 months to 3 years. So the autonomy is very important in this stage because it builds confidence in the individual. Right. So if the individual struggles too much with learning to eat, for example, or learning to use the toilet, they'll develop shame. They'll start to doubt themselves, and it'll really affect them for the rest of their learning life. So on to the next stage, initiative versus guilt, 3 to 6 years. This is when students typically start going to school sometime in this general range of 3 to 6. The social relationships kind of start happening. There's a lot more responsibility, and they're given tasks, right? They're given homework, things, they have to do that, may not want to do, but they ideally should learn the initiative of being a real go-getter and taking ownership of your learning. So again, taking ownership of learning is extremely important. So I feel this is also a vital stage. If the student struggles too much on the stage, they can start to suffer from a lot of guilt about maybe obligations that they aren't giving their best effort on, and that can kind of turn them away from a lot of future learning. So it's definitely something we as educators and just fellow humans who care about the future want to avoid. So on to stage four. Only really one stage during elementary and middle school, as you can see here, spans 6 to 12 years. So at some point in that very wide range, all the students should learn the value of industry, the value of work, the value of a good job, and they should start to sort of see themselves and reflect on their own progress. They also start to reflect a little more socially, I believe, in this stage. And again, this is 6 to 12. The end of that, they're entering middle school, so there's a lot more responsibility. So it kind of challenges the students to bring the industry out. And that is definitely something they will need to succeed, because the jump from elementary school to middle school is a pretty harsh one in my experience. It's a big jump in difficulty. So obviously, we don't want students to start developing inferiority, right? If they're struggling and they start comparing themselves to other students who maybe aren't struggling, that's going to be really difficult for them to work past later in life. So on to our next stage, stage in high school, and that is identity versus role confusion. So obviously, we all have a sense of self in some way, shape, or form, probably from birth. But this is the first time learners are actively engaging in forming their own sense of self. They're trying new things. They're the stereotypical teenager kind of rebelling to see what feels right. It's all sort of hypothesized, whether consciously or unconsciously, and tested. So if they don't like this, maybe they'll try something else. And obviously, the role confusion can play a big role in the sorry. Um, Role confusion can play a large role in the lack of identity, and we will see later on why lacking an identity can be a really difficult thing, especially moving into adulthood. Because remember, as I said earlier, all these stages sort of build off of each other, right? So if you don't get maybe the best experience on one stage, the next stage is going to be that much more difficult, because you're already starting from behind, right? It's like you're starting a race, 5 meters behind the starting line. So now, oh, excuse me, sorry about that. So Marcia's 4 identity statuses. This was research, like I said, that added on to Erickson's initial theory. And this really helped me understand the identity and role confusion stage more, because it laid out a more concrete roadmap of what this process actually looks like. So you can see in the bottom right hand corner here, I've laid out all the steps. And as you can see, it's very scientific, whether consciously or not. Commitment, so you're committing to one part after deliberating what I guess the best part would be based on whatever factors you're thinking about at the time. Then there's moratorium, right? If your hypothesis fails, if it's not supported, you go back to the drawing board. So that's sort of what's happening here in the moratorium phase. They're throwing out an identity based choice, and probably suffering an identity crisis. Identity foreclosure, that's what it sounds like, right? When a business forecloses, they kind of pack it in, and that's sort of what happens in this stage. And it is the sort of blind removal of your own cognition and beliefs, and to just kind of piggyback, for lack of a more professional word, onto some sort of usually older authority figure. So Most of the times it's parents, but obviously it can be a teacher, any sort of family friend, perhaps an uncle, but any sort of older figure, and just sort of taking on their beliefs, goals, commitments, what have you. And then there is identity diffusion, which is the diffusion of the identity. So when the learner feels the identity is no longer working for them, it kind of spreads out, right? The vigor they were partaking in this new aspect of identity dies out, and it sort of diffuses. So yeah, the confusion. So now we're on to the adulthood stages, and all of adulthood is actually divided into just three stages, which I thought was pretty crazy, to divide that much into just three stages. But I think they're very general for that reason, and it really helps them. So the first stage, early adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. So we're starting to see parallels here, right? This is sort of a adult version of the trust versus mistrust thing. So we're really seeing how the stages compound on each other, as we learn more and more about them. So obviously, success is forming strong, healthy relationships that aren't based off of ulterior motives or mutual benefits, anything like that. So it's putting aside the logic and being able to form a purely emotional, intimate relationship. And obviously, isolation is a big risk if they can't adjust to that new thing, because that's a very new thing into early adulthood, that level of intimacy. Generation versus stagnation. So that is, or generativity, excuse me. Generativity is the concern, not concern, but the desire to support generations past yourself. So it's the investment in the future, the pay it forward, and most times that comes in the form of parenting. But obviously, we have so many great people in all communities who help out. We have coaches, we have, you know, teachers, obviously, principals, local community officers, firemen, EMTs, policemen, all sorts of people for who can really make a difference and support, the youth in their middle adulthood. And the final stage is ego versus despair, late adulthood. So I like to think of this as the sorting it out phase. It's a little morbid, but it's kind of like writing a will almost. You're reflecting on your entire life up to that point. Ideally, you're making peace, but you can fall into some pretty dark despair if you're not able to make peace with the uniqueness of your identity and the experiences that led up to it. So that can be difficult, especially in late adulthood. So conclusions and parting thoughts. So one thing I have criticized Erickson for, and many people have in the book too, in this presentation for, was the not too much depth on how, not any depth at all really, on how social constructs like race, gender, and sex all play a part in the formation of identity. So there are some people who think that race is sort of an identity trump card, that is just the most important factor in identity formation. So I really think, because there's a school of thought that makes it so important, I really wanted to touch on this. So Marcia, as we said earlier, developed the four stages. There was also commitment, and I believe it was extraction, that she talked about as well. And that's sort of the process of trying on new things, throwing them out if they don't work, trying on new things, and it's a cyclical. All of Marcia's findings were kind of cyclical, so it's repeated over and over again until there is success. Then William Cross developed 5 steps that added more insight into how the formation of identity for African American students may differ, just based off of the color of their skin from other students, mostly Caucasian. But So the five stages, we have the pre-encounter, where they sort of value other aspects of identity more. They kind of ignore the that part of their identity, or they're neutral toward, or in some cases they might even be anti-black, which is interesting and sad. But obviously this is the first stage, so with that growth mindset, they can hopefully get past that. So stage two is the encounter. They encounter some sort of covert, overt, or institutional racism, and that sort of puts them in. It's sort of a system shock that puts them more in touch on a cognitive level with that part of their identity. So then we have the immersion. So after the encounter, they sort of have anxiety about how valid their identity is, right, based on however they view that identity, right? Because we're always making social comparisons. So they're comparing themselves to the other African American students. Am I as this as them? Am I doing as well in English? Am I doing as well in math? And the desire kind of arises out of that constant questioning of the identity, to learn more about racial heritage. And then there is the internalization, excuse me. So they've done their homework, they've desired to know more, they went and pursued it, and now they feel connected and confident with their identity. And so they can kind of accept and stop the questions of, am I, the book uses the term the right kind of black. I'm not too sure how to define that, but I think we can all sort of make inferences as to what it means. I know I can fill in the blanks. But so now once they've stopped questioning it and stopped constantly comparing themselves, they can actually be confident in their own unique identity and understand that while they are a black student, they are also an individual. And that's a great thing that should be celebrated and it can be celebrated while still being a completely functioning member of the community you belong to. And the final stage of William Cross's steps are internalization. So that's the commitment to whatever cause they found that resonates with them, or whatever part of identity or practice or belief they found that resonates with them. And that is the continued interest. So it's not a phase thing. It's got to be something that sticks with them for a significant period of time to be truly formative. So that's why we make that distinction, because how many people have been truly changed by something they were interested in for a week or a month, right? So you need that commitment. Anyways, I hope you found this presentation insightful. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about Erikson's psychosocial development theory. Have a great day, everyone.